John Thune thought he was proving the math was impossible. Instead, he gave conservatives exactly what they had been missing in the Save America Act fight: a number. 20 Republican senators sat down with the Senate Majority Leader to discuss possible rule changes that could allow the bill to move with a simple majority. 15 of them said no. 15. That was supposed to settle the argument. Thune put the number on the record after a closed-door conference meeting, and the message seemed straightforward: the votes for changing the rules were not there. But the number did not end the fight. It changed the fight. Until that moment, conservatives had been attacking a procedural wall. Now they had a finite count. Somewhere inside those 20 senators were 15 Republicans who had told their own majority leader they would not support the rule change being discussed. Some names are already publicly associated with resistance to changing the filibuster. Others remain less clear. And that uncertainty created the next fight. Who are the 15, and how many of them can actually be moved? At first glance, 15 out of 20 looks devastating for the conservative position. If 3/4 of the Republicans Thune consulted rejected the idea, why would anyone believe the wall could crack? Because Thune did not meet with the entire Republican conference. He met with 20 senators. The other 33 were not in that meeting. Their absence does not mean they support changing the rules. Some have remained silent, some have kept their positions ambiguous. But it does mean the 15-5 split cannot simply be treated as a vote of the entire conference. That distinction is now driving the pressure campaign, and Tommy Tuberville made clear where that pressure is headed. After Thune's number became public, the Alabama senator went to the Senate floor and called it beyond embarrassing that Republicans continued to block the Save America Act. Republicans, not Democrats. That is the political shift underneath this entire story. For most of the fight, the pressure flowed in one direction: Republicans against Democrats, Trump against the Senate's procedural barrier, conservatives against the 60-vote threshold, standing between the bill and passage. Now the pressure is turning inward. Instead of asking only why Democrats are blocking the legislation, conservative senators and outside activists are increasingly asking why Republicans are protecting the procedure that allows the block to continue. And once the argument becomes internal, the number 15 starts to matter in a completely different way. It is no longer an abstract complaint about Senate rules. It is a limited group of Republican senators who may eventually have to explain, publicly and individually, why they believe preserving the current procedure is more important than changing it for this particular fight. But that does not mean their position is irrational. In fact, the strongest defense of the filibuster comes from the same history conservatives are now using against them. The Senate has changed its rules before when a majority decided the stakes justified it. In 2013, Harry Reid ended the 60-vote threshold for most judicial and executive nominations. 4 years later, Mitch McConnell extended that change to Supreme Court nominees in order to confirm Neil Gorsuch. Those decisions matter because they destroy the idea that Senate procedure is untouchable. The rules have already been altered. The real argument is over where the line should be drawn next. And that is where Mike Lee's proposal becomes far more important than a simple demand to end the filibuster. Lee is not asking Republicans to eliminate the 60-vote threshold for every piece of legislation. His argument is narrower. If Democrats want to block the Save America Act, he wants them to have to physically hold the Senate floor and keep the filibuster going themselves. A talking filibuster. The minority could still block the bill, but obstruction would no longer be an invisible administrative act. Senators would have to stand on the floor, speak publicly, and continue holding the floor for as long as they wanted the block to last. That distinction is now becoming the first real pressure point inside the group of 15. Because a Republican senator can oppose abolishing the legislative filibuster entirely and still face a much harder question: would restoring the talking filibuster really destroy minority rights, or would it simply force the minority to visibly defend the obstruction it is already using? That is the opening Mike Lee is trying to exploit. And the answer matters because the 15 are not all standing in exactly the same place. Some oppose changing the rules. Some support the underlying bill but refuse to change the filibuster. Others have broader objections to the legislation itself. Once those differences are separated, the wall starts to look less like one solid block and more like several different arguments being held together by the same number. The first senator who illustrates that difference is Mitch McConnell. McConnell's position is not built around opposition to the Save America Act alone. His argument is institutional. He has warned that whatever procedural weapon Republicans create for themselves today will eventually belong to Democrats too. In his view, the filibuster exists precisely to slow down major federal action when a temporary majority wants to move faster than the institution normally allows. That is a serious argument, because the precedent cuts both ways. Republicans may want a lower barrier for this bill now. A future Democratic majority could want that same lower barrier for an election law. Republicans strongly oppose later. So McConnell's position is not simply no. It is, do not build a tool you cannot control once power changes hands. Susan Collins presents a different problem. She has supported the substance of the House-passed Save America Act. During the June vote, she backed the Clean Mike Lee amendment and helped produce the 50-vote majority conservatives keep pointing to. But Collins has also been explicit that she will not vote to eliminate or fundamentally alter the legislative filibuster. That creates one of the sharpest contradictions in the entire fight. A senator can support the bill itself and still oppose changing the procedure needed to move it across the finish line. That is why identifying the 15 matters. The group is not necessarily 15 senators united by one objection. It can include senators who support the policy but defend the rules, senators who oppose the bill as written, and senators whose positions on the mechanics remain deliberately unclear. Lisa Murkowski shows why those distinctions cannot be blurred. Murkowski has publicly raised substantive objections to the bill, arguing that its implementation could create serious problems for rural Alaska and potentially disenfranchise some of her own constituents. She has not backed away from that position. But that does not automatically prove she was one of the 15 senators who specifically rejected the rule changes Thune discussed. Those are two different questions. Opposing the bill is not the same thing as opposing a talking filibuster proposal. Procedural caution may point in that direction, but the count alone does not establish every individual name. Beyond McConnell, Collins, and Murkowski, the picture gets murkier. Some senators have kept their position on filibuster reform ambiguous. Others support the underlying legislation while avoiding a clear, on-the-record answer about exactly what rule changes they would accept. John Cornyn became the most important example of why that ambiguity matters. Before losing his Republican primary to Ken Paxton, Cornyn had been viewed as a reliable defender of the 60-vote threshold. After the defeat, his public position on filibuster reform for this specific bill changed. Whether that reversal reflected genuine procedural movement or election year pressure is not clear from the record presented here. But politically, conservatives do not need it to prove everything. They only need it to prove one thing: positions can move. That is why Mike Lee's campaign has become so aggressive. His argument is designed to separate senators who oppose eliminating the filibuster from senators who might accept changing how obstruction actually works. He is not telling them they must erase minority rights. He is telling them that if 41 Democratic senators want to stop the bill, those senators should have to do it visibly, physically, and publicly. Stand on the floor. Keep speaking. Own the block. That is a far different political image from a bill disappearing behind a procedural threshold. And the timing makes the image more dangerous. A talking filibuster would put the fight directly on camera only weeks before a national election. Every senator participating would have to defend the decision in public while voters were already paying attention. That is exactly why conservatives see Lee's proposal as a wedge. It gives institutionally cautious Republicans a position short of full filibuster elimination. They can say they still support minority rights while also arguing that obstruction should carry a visible cost. Rick Scott is applying pressure from another direction. His target is not only the 15, it is John Thune himself. Scott's case is blunt. The majority leader has tools available and is choosing not to use them. In that framing, the problem is not simply that Thune lacks the votes. The problem is that he lacks the will to force the issue. That accusation changes the center of gravity again. Now, Thune is not just reporting the math. He is being challenged over whether he is using every available option to change it. And while that argument is unfolding over the filibuster, another obstacle is appearing on the alternative path: reconciliation. Thune has treated reconciliation as the primary route that could avoid the filibuster fight altogether. But Ron Johnson has attached a condition. The House framework includes $10 billion in election integrity grants without corresponding spending cuts. Johnson has said he will not support a reconciliation vehicle carrying those provisions unless the spending is offset. That means the supposed escape route has its own problem. If Republicans cannot change the filibuster rules, reconciliation may be the alternative. But if reconciliation depends on Johnson, and Johnson demands offsets, then Thune is now dealing with pressure from two directions at once. One group is telling him to change the procedure. Another senator is telling him the procedure that avoids that change still does not have his vote under the current fiscal terms. The path is not blocked by one argument. It is being squeezed by several. And outside the Senate, that pressure is becoming more personal. Outside the Senate chamber, that pressure is being organized in a much more direct way. Scott Pressler has been building what amounts to a public accountability campaign around the 15. His operation in Pennsylvania has focused on voter roll cleanup and Republican registration, but the infrastructure created for that work can also be turned towards Senate pressure, and his message is simple. These senators represent specific states. Some are approaching re-election. Their voters have their own expectations, and once the 15 become names instead of a private count, every one of those senators becomes easier to pressure individually. That is exactly what makes Thune's disclosure so consequential. Before the number became public, opposition to changing the rules could remain abstract. Senators could defend the filibuster as an institution without being forced into a highly visible personal fight over this bill. Now, conservatives have a target number. But pressure alone does not mean the 15 will collapse. There is a reason some Republican senators are willing to absorb the criticism. The institutional case for protecting the legislative filibuster is not irrational, even for senators who support the Save America Act itself. Their concern is what happens after Republicans lose control. If Republicans establish a path that allows 51 votes to move major election legislation today, the next Democratic majority inherits that same path tomorrow. A mechanism used to pass voter identification requirements under Republican control could later be used to advance same-day registration, automatic registration, or other election rules Republicans oppose. That is the risk the defenders of the filibuster are looking at. They are not merely protecting an old Senate custom. They are protecting a structural veto they believe could become more valuable when their party is back in the minority. And that is what makes this internal fight harder than a simple loyalty test. The conservative response is just as direct. Republicans have already accepted major exceptions to the filibuster when the political prize was important enough. The Senate changed the threshold for most judicial and executive nominations in 2013. Republicans changed it again for Supreme Court nominees in 2017. So conservatives are asking a much sharper question now. Why is legislation the line that suddenly cannot be crossed? More specifically, why should Republicans protect the procedural barrier on the very issue that is blocking the president's stated top legislative priority? That is the argument the 15 are now being forced to defend. And the timing makes that defense even more uncomfortable. The closer the election gets, the less this looks like an internal Senate seminar about procedure, and the more it looks like a visible choice between preserving the rule and delivering the result. That is why the next phase comes down to 3 pressure points. The first is the talking filibuster. This is Mike Lee's opening. A senator who refuses to abolish the legislative filibuster entirely may still be willing to support a rule that requires senators to physically hold the floor. That distinction matters because it offers a compromise between eliminating minority rights and preserving the current system exactly as it is. If even 1 or 2 senators inside the 15 decide that distinction is politically or institutionally acceptable, the math changes. The second pressure point is government funding. Trump has stated that he will not sign government funding legislation without the Save America Act attached. That changes the cost of doing nothing. A senator can tolerate a stalled bill. A potential government shutdown is a different calculation. Once the Save America Act becomes tied to government funding, the procedural fight is no longer isolated. The cost of maintaining the same position can expand far beyond one piece of legislation. And when a real deadline enters the picture, positions that looked fixed can become less stable. The third pressure point is John Cornyn. Cornyn matters because conservatives see his reversal as evidence that political pressure can alter a senator's public position. For years, he had been one of the most reliable defenders of the filibuster. Then Ken Paxton defeated him in the Republican primary by nearly 30 points after Trump endorsed Paxton and made the SAVE Act a central issue in the race. Within weeks of that defeat, Cornyn publicly changed his position on filibuster reform for this specific bill. That does not prove the remaining senators will do the same. It proves only that the cost calculation can change. And for conservatives trying to break a group of 15, one demonstrated reversal is enough to keep the pressure campaign alive. Because this fight no longer depends on moving every Republican senator at once. It depends on finding the first few who decide that holding the line has become more expensive than moving it. That is why Tommy Tuberville's floor attack matters so much. When he called the situation beyond embarrassing, he was not simply venting frustration. He was putting a public label on a private Republican split. For months, the easier story was Democrats blocking and Republicans pushing. But the June vote complicated that picture. 50 senators backed the clean Mike Lee amendment. Add the vice president, and conservatives had the working majority they had been trying to prove existed. The obstacle was no longer simply whether the policy could command majority support. The obstacle was what happened after that majority ran into the Senate's procedural threshold. And that is why Thune's 15 changed the argument. A majority can exist on the substance of a bill while the bill still fails to advance because the rules require more than a simple majority. That is exactly the contradiction conservatives are now exploiting. They are telling Republican voters, the votes for the policy are there, but Republican senators are still protecting the rule that prevents those votes from being enough. For the 15, that is a much harder message to answer than a generic defense of Senate tradition, especially because they are not being asked one identical question. Some are being asked whether they would accept a talking filibuster. Some are being asked whether they would support a different procedural route. Some are being asked whether their support for the bill means anything if they refuse every mechanism that could actually move it. And some may soon be asked why their private position differs from what voters in their states expect them to do. That is where the pressure campaign becomes dangerous politically. A senator can defend the filibuster in abstract terms for years. It is much harder to defend that same position when the argument is attached to a specific bill, a specific deadline, a specific president, and a specific election. The conservative strategy is designed to make every one of those variables visible at the same time. Mike Lee applies pressure on procedure. Rick Scott applies pressure on leadership. Ron Johnson complicates reconciliation. Scott Pressler applies pressure from outside the chamber. And the Cornyn example hangs over all of it as evidence that a position considered stable can become less stable when electoral consequences become real. None of that guarantees movement. The 15 may hold. Some may decide that protecting the legislative filibuster is worth the political cost because they believe the long-term institutional consequences are greater than the short-term benefit of passing this bill. Their strongest defense is long-term. Any lower barrier Republicans create now can eventually be inherited by a Democratic majority. But conservatives answer that the filibuster has already been altered, exceptions already exist, and the proposal drawing the most pressure is not complete abolition. So the 15 are not simply defending the filibuster in the abstract. They are defending this version of it for this category of legislation in this political moment against a proposal that would still allow the minority to obstruct. That is a much more difficult line to hold. And the calendar makes it harder. The election is approaching. The government funding fight is approaching. The public identification of more names is approaching. Each development raises the cost of silence. A senator who never states a clear position can avoid part of the fight for a while, but once the conservative campaign attaches a name to the number, ambiguity becomes harder to maintain. Then the question is no longer theoretical. Do you support changing the mechanics of the filibuster for this bill? Do you support the talking filibuster? Do you support reconciliation if the spending issue is resolved? If the answer to every available path is no, then the political argument against that senator becomes much simpler. And simplicity is exactly what pressure campaigns need. The conservative revolt does not have to win every procedural argument inside Washington. It has to make the public argument outside Washington easier to understand. 50 votes for the policy, 15 Republicans protecting the procedural barrier. That is the frame they are trying to lock in before the next decisive moment arrives. And if even a small number of those 15 decide they no longer want to be identified with that frame, the entire calculation changes again. That is why the next senator to move matters more than the size of the original group. 15 sounds like a wall, but the conservative strategy is not built around flipping all 15 at once. It is built around breaking the appearance that all 15 are equally committed to the same position. The moment one senator accepts the talking filibuster while still rejecting full elimination, the group becomes less unified. The moment another senator changes position under election pressure, Cornyn is no longer an isolated example. The moment reconciliation becomes viable for someone who previously resisted it, Thune gains another path. That is the real contest now, not whether every procedural objection disappears, whether enough of them can be separated, because the 15 are being held together by different concerns. McConnell's argument is institutional. Collins demonstrates that support for the bill does not automatically translate into support for changing Senate rules. Murkowski's objections reach into the substance and implementation of the legislation itself. Johnson's demand is fiscal and tied to the reconciliation route. Those positions do not fit neatly into one ideological box, and that cuts both ways. It makes the revolt harder because there is no single argument that answers every senator. But it also means there is no single reason all 15 must remain together. That is why the talking filibuster matters so much. Lee's proposal does not require every Republican to suddenly abandon decades of concern about minority rights. It gives them a narrower question to answer. Should 41 senators be able to stop legislation without continuously holding the floor? Or should obstruction require the senators using it to remain present, speak publicly, and sustain it themselves? For a senator like Collins, that distinction could be more politically defensible than abolishing the legislative filibuster entirely. For an institutionalist like McConnell, it may still go too far. For someone whose position has not been stated clearly, it creates a new choice that did not exist when the debate was framed only as 60 votes versus 51. That is exactly what a pressure campaign wants. More choices create more fault lines, and more fault lines make a bloc harder to hold together. The shutdown threat adds another layer. If the Save America Act becomes part of a government funding confrontation, the cost of holding the same procedural position expands beyond one stalled bill and into campaign season. That does not guarantee movement. It simply raises the political and electoral cost of standing still. And that is why the Cornyn case remains relevant. Conservatives see his reversal as a warning that a position treated as stable can become less stable when the political cost changes. His case does not tell them who moves next or whether anyone will. It tells them only that pressure is not meaningless. Tuberville's beyond embarrassing attack marked the moment the argument became openly internal. The old narrative was simple. Democrats block, Republicans push, the filibuster holds. But the 50-vote result complicated that story, and Thune's disclosure gave the procedural obstacle a number. That is why 15 now matters more as a political target than it did as a private conference count. It tells conservatives how large the obstacle is and, as more names become public, where to aim the pressure. And the final question is no longer whether conservatives can describe the obstacle. Thune already did that for them. The question is whether the 15 remain 15 once the cost of holding their position keeps rising. That is the pressure point conservatives are trying to reach before the calendar runs out. Not 15 simultaneous conversions. Not a dramatic collapse overnight. A sequence. One senator decides the talking filibuster is different from abolishing the filibuster. Another concludes that a funding standoff changes the risk. Another sees what happened to Cornyn and decides a private procedural position is no longer politically sustainable. If that begins to happen, the number Thune disclosed stops being a static count. It becomes a moving target. And that is why the next several weeks matter more than the last several months of argument. There are 3 signals that will show whether the group is actually beginning to crack. And these 3 signals matter enough to repeat, because from this point forward, they are no longer abstract arguments. They are measurable tests. First, the talking filibuster. Mike Lee does not need every Republican to support abolishing the legislative filibuster. He only needs 1 or 2 senators inside the 15 to publicly separate a talking filibuster from full elimination. The moment that happens, a middle position exists, and every remaining holdout has to explain why even that narrower change goes too far. Second, government funding. If the Save America Act becomes tied to a funding confrontation, the cost of leaving the bill unresolved changes. A senator who can tolerate one stalled bill may calculate the risk differently when the same position becomes part of a broader government funding fight during campaign season. Third, electoral pressure. Cornyn remains the clearest example conservatives can point to. His case does not prove another senator will move, and it does not prove political pressure caused every part of his reversal. But it does show that a position presented as stable can change when the political cost changes. That is why the campaign around the 15 is becoming more focused on names. A number creates pressure. A name creates accountability. Once voters can connect a specific senator to a specific procedural position, that senator has to defend his or her own choice in a way an anonymous conference count never required. And that is the calculation Thune may not have intended to create when he disclosed the 15-5 split. He was showing why rule changes looked impossible. Conservatives heard something else. They heard that the obstacle was finite. 15 senators. Not an invisible institution. Not an unknowable Senate tradition. 15 Republican votes on procedure. That is the frame the revolt is trying to lock in. 50 votes for the policy, 15 Republicans protecting the procedural barrier, and a shrinking calendar that makes every individual position harder to keep private. That is the political message conservatives want voters to remember. The unresolved choice remains the same. The short-term cost of leaving the president's priority blocked, or the long-term cost of weakening a Senate protection Republicans may want the next time they are in the minority. By putting the number 15 into public view, Thune made sure that choice would no longer remain entirely private. That is where the fight stands now. The policy majority has already been demonstrated. The procedural wall remains. The question is whether the 15 stay intact once the pressure becomes personal. Mike Lee is attacking the mechanics of obstruction. Rick Scott is pressuring leadership. Ron Johnson keeps reconciliation from becoming an effortless escape route. Outside the chamber, activists are trying to turn a private count into public names. The institutional defense remains real. Any procedural weapon Republicans create today can be inherited by Democrats tomorrow. The conservative answer remains real too. Senate thresholds have already been changed before, and the talking filibuster proposal is narrower than full abolition. Neither side has erased the other's argument. What has changed is the cost of holding a position. The talking filibuster creates a narrower choice. The funding confrontation raises the cost of stalemate. The election calendar raises the cost of silence. And Cornyn remains evidence that a public position can change when political incentives change. None of that guarantees the 15 will break. They may hold, but they no longer have the advantage of anonymity as a group. Thune changed that when he said the number out loud. 15. That number was supposed to demonstrate why the rule change strategy could not work. Instead, it became the organizing principle for the people trying to make it work. And that is why the next movement matters so much. If no one inside that group changes position, the procedural wall survives. If one or two move toward the talking filibuster, the argument changes. If election pressure produces another Cornyn-style reversal, the assumption that the block is fixed becomes harder to maintain. If the funding fight intensifies, senators who were comfortable with the cost of leaving one bill stalled may have to reconsider what the stalemate now carries with it. The revolt does not need 15 senators to change their minds at the same time. It needs the number to start shrinking. Because once 15 becomes 14 or 13, the entire psychology of the fight changes. A wall looks permanent until the first section gives way. And right now, that is the question hanging over the Republican conference. Does the number 15 hold? Or was Thune's attempt to prove the math impossible the moment conservatives finally learned exactly where to apply the pressure? That answer will come down to what happens when the names become public. For now, the number is 15. But a number can hide differences that names cannot. Once individual senators are identified, each will have to defend his or her own position, not the position of an anonymous bloc, not the position of the Senate, and not the position of Republican leadership as a whole. That is when the pressure campaign becomes personal. And it is also when conservatives will find out whether public exposure actually moves senators or simply causes them to dig in harder. That is the unresolved risk at the center of the strategy. Pressure can change incentives. It can also harden resistance. The Cornyn example shows that a public position can change after the political cost changes, but it does not guarantee that the same calculation will apply to the remaining senators. So the next meaningful development is not another speech about the filibuster. It is a name, then another, and, eventually, a vote or public commitment that tells everyone whether the 15 are still holding together. Because Thune already gave this fight its defining number. Now conservatives are trying to attach 15 identities to it. If they succeed, every senator on that list will face the same basic choice: defend the procedural barrier publicly, move toward the talking filibuster, support another viable path, or explain why the bill should remain blocked despite the majority that already exists on the substance. And that is where the story goes next. Not toward a guaranteed collapse, not toward an inevitable victory, toward a test of whether 15 Republican senators can maintain the same procedural position once the cost of that position becomes visible to the voters who elected them. So the question is simple. Should conservatives release every name tied to that group of 15? Or would public exposure make those senators more likely to hold the line? That answer may determine whether the pressure campaign breaks the wall or makes it harder.